everybody. Welcome to our webinar today, Solar Net Metering Under Threat. I'm Joe Wachunas here, as always, with Brian Stewart from Electrify Now. We'll introduce our esteemed panelists in just a second, but welcome to today's webinar. So this webinar is co-hosted by two organizations. One is Solar United Neighbors, helping people fight for their energy rights. I'll put a link in the chat to Solar United Neighbors. Check them out, and Angela will talk a little bit more about this great org. And it's also brought to you by, of course, Electrify Now. We're an all-volunteer organization empowering everyone to realize the benefits of electrification. We boil our message into four easy steps. Clean up your electric supply. That's what we'll be talking about today, with solar energy, if possible, on your rooftop. If not, community solar is a great option. Number two is electrify your home. We've done many webinars on all the ways to do that. We'll talk about that in our YouTube channel. Electrify your transportation is number three, with an electric car, an electric bike, and electrifying everyone, trying to bring everyone, even those disadvantaged communities, along for electrification. And speaking of that, Seeds for the Soul is the great nonprofit we are partnering with in 2024 to raise money as part of our webinar series. Thank you for your donations. This organization is a fantastic organization that helps people with limited means go solar. They've solarized over 130 homes, and all of your donations that you give to Seeds for the Soul through Electrify Now are donated directly to this organization. So thanks so much. Just wanted to put in a plug for our upcoming webinar in March. On March 21st, we're going to be talking about gas appliance pollution impacts and solutions. We got some really great panelists lined up for that one. I'll put a link to the Zoom registration in the chat. And like I said before, check out all of our recordings on electrification at our YouTube channel. You can see the address on the screen, or just Google Electrify Now YouTube. Make sure to subscribe to our channel for all the latest webinars. Great. So, Brian, talk to us about why people are installing solar.
Yeah, this whole topic of net metering is a really important topic, and we want to start just big picture. If you just, most of you probably would be able to guess, but if you ask someone why they're interested in installing solar or why they did it, this is typically what people say. It's about saving money on energy bills. Is important, of course. People like the idea of energy independence and reducing air and carbon pollution for sure. I think people are aware that this creates good jobs locally, and then there's this whole factor of reliability and reliance, whether that's a personal system thing or even a system-wide thing. This distributed energy generation feels like it provides that. So I think it's safe to say that solar net metering underpins almost all these benefits in terms of being able to realize those, as whether you're a homeowner or even maybe a small business wanting to install solar. And partly as a result of these net metering policies, in which we'll obviously go into in more detail with our panelists here, you see in some places a very wide proliferation of solar. This is Southern California. And I look at this picture and say, wow, this is the way the world ought to be. You've got all these buildings with available rooftop space that get lots of sunshine. So yes, why wouldn't we put solar panels there? But it's a little bit more complicated than that, which is why we'll be having this conversation. And the utilities don't necessarily agree with that point of view that solar should be everywhere, which is part of the reason why this sort of friction is occurring around the topic of solar net metering, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So we're going to loosely cover these topics. How has net metering impacted the rooftop solar industry? And generally speaking, what are the costs and benefits of distributed solar? Because this is a really interesting topic. It's not just about the pennies that are saved here and there. There's a lot of other things that are more maybe intangible benefits of distributed solar that need to be understood and recognized. And then we have some really good examples of how changes in net metering policies have affected rooftop solar in other states. So, Oregon is the one that's looking at doing some things now, but we can see what's happened in other states. So we'll get that perspective. And then it's important to understand what the justification is. Why are the utilities asking for this? So we'll dive into that a little bit. And then here in Oregon specifically, it's important to know what these potential changes to net metering would mean for existing customers as well as future solar owners. We have two amazing panelists with us today to help us unpack this conversation. We'll be starting with Nathan Phelps. He's the managing director of the Vote Solar Regulatory Advocacy Hub. His work focuses on the regulation of distributed energy resources at state public utility commissions. His work includes advocating for just and inclusive policies, including net metering, rate design, and performance-based regulation, and other mechanisms to deliver the benefits of distributed energy resources to everyone. And then prior to joining Vote Solar, he was a senior economist at the Massachusetts Department of Public Utilities. So a lot of experience in this area, and we'll be able to talk generally about this concept at a national level. And then we'll be hearing from Angela Crowley-Koch, who's the executive director of OSIA, Oregon Solar and Storage Industries Association. This is a trade association that was founded in 1981 to promote clean, renewable storage and solar and storage technologies. And members in OSIA include businesses, nonprofits, and other solar and storage stakeholders. Angela has over 2 decades of experience in public policy advocacy and has held leadership roles in multiple environmental and health advocacy groups, including names you probably recognize like Physicians for Social Responsibility, and here in Oregon, Oregon Environmental Council, a really important organization. So really pleased to have both of these presenters with us. And I'll be turning it over to get us started to Nathan. So thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Just 1 second while I share my screen.
While Nathan is pulling up his presentation, I just want to remind people that, if you have questions, please put them in Q&A. We'll be monitoring that. We hope to have a robust Q&A section towards the end of the presentation.
Great, thank you. So thank you so much for inviting me to be here. I'm happy to be here today. And this is what I'll be covering. I'll note that I'll be going through some of these slides pretty quickly, but I'm happy to make my presentation available afterwards. So Vote Solar, we work primarily at the regulatory level and the legislative level in states around the country. We're active in about half of the states around the country, and we're really trying to realize a 100% clean energy future and trying to really center people at that. So let's talk a little bit about history. I tell this story because Stephen Strong is quite the character. He energized the first system, really the first net metering system in 1979, and he didn't even get permission from the utility to do it. He just turned it on. And then he told the utility that the system was active and running at a press conference where they were also a presenter. Quite an interesting story and character. Little different nowadays. But if we step back for a second, think about net metering as a statewide policy. Prior to 1978, there really was no obligation for utilities to install or allow systems to be installed, let alone purchase any generation. And Congress recognized that, and they passed in 1978 the Public Utility Regulatory Policy Act, or PURPA. This was a pretty key moment in energy policy, especially when we think about renewable energy. States had to implement many aspects of PURPA, and one of those was to set avoided cost. Avoided cost was the price, if you will, that utilities had to purchase electricity from renewable generation. Massachusetts, in the process of setting avoided cost, decided for small systems, they would set the avoided cost at the retail rate, and then voila, we had the first net metering. You can see that happened in 1981. One day after this order was issued, Arizona issued a very similar order. And then Minnesota was the first state to pass net metering legislation a couple years later. Let's go over the basics of net metering. What is it? If we think of net metering, it's really a program to compensate customers with distributed generation, or DG. This is the rooftop solar, except the solar that you see on customers' houses and small businesses, etc. It's a way for customers to offset their own electricity usage, and it's a way for customers to be compensated for any electricity that they generate and send onto the grid. So the netting in net metering really takes place over the course of a month, normally, historically at least. So over the course of a month, if a customer's usage or consumption exceeds the amount of electricity they generate, they pay their electric bill for that net consumption. If the customer generates more electricity than they consume, than they use, then they get a credit on their bill. And that credit rolls over to the next billing period, the next month, if you will. The netting aspect of net metering is really quite critical here. The netting is pretty easy for customers to understand. And as a result, that's one of the primary reasons that it has been such a successful program at the residential level. Simplicity. It's really the simplicity aspect of net metering that is a key contributor to its success. If we look at how net metering has evolved, it's no longer what was originally envisioned back in the 1980s. So we have still net metering is pervasive across the country. It is more common than not, but we do have a lot of states that have started to move away from net metering. Some of those changes have happened at the regulatory level, and some of those changes have happened at the legislative level. And if we dig down a little bit more, the rate that customers are compensated, the value that they're getting for any net excess generation or excess generation, we're starting to see some really big differences here. So if we think of the value of generation in general, it fluctuates throughout the day. It's more expensive to generate electricity during certain times of the day because there's more load, there's more generations that's needed. So the price fluctuates throughout the day. So if we take an optimistic view of the differences between states, we could say that the states are trying to better align the value with the compensation, the value of the generation to the compensation that customers are receiving. So let's take a little bit of a closer look at the value that distributed generation solar provides. I love this slide because it's a nice visual representation of the different categories of benefits. At the core, the center, those are the values that are pretty much universally accepted as real. So these are the things that utilities would often agree, yes, these are the values that distributed generation provides. As we get further away from the center, it becomes more and more contentious. And this can get very complicated very, very quickly. And furthermore, some of these costs and benefits are really clearly available, readily available to utilities and to public utility commissions, while others not so much. Some public utility commissions don't even think that it's within their purview to consider social and environmental benefits, as an example. But when we're thinking about weighing these costs and benefits in order to see, like, is net metering something that should be continued or doesn't need to evolve, the process can be very, very difficult. The quantification can be very, very difficult. And some states have tried to look at the net benefit and found that the benefits far exceed the cost and really the retail rate. A couple examples of that are Minnesota and Maine. But despite of this quantification, Maine, as an example, still changed net metering, even though they had evidence that it was a net benefit to all ratepayers, all customers. And unfortunately, this is where pessimism can start to seep into the conversation. The costs tend to be very easy to calculate. They're things that the utilities can pull from their books, so to speak, quite easily, while the benefits tend to be much more difficult to quantify, much more difficult to calculate. And so far too often, many benefits are just ignored. And when the costs are emphasized and the benefits are ignored, This leads to the perception of costs exceeding benefits. And in my opinion, this is really what happened in Idaho, and Angela will be touching upon that. One thing I want to try to emphasize here is drivers and rate increases, like so the rate that you pay for electricity. This slide is old, to be clear, so the values almost certainly have changed. But this is a report from Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, and it illustrates that solar is not the main driver of rate increases. The main driver of rate increases is what's on the bottom here, CapEx, or capital expenditures. So while solar may get a lot of airtime for driving up rates for customers, it's really not the primary driver. And I don't have a lot of time to get into the utility business model here, but the Cliff Notes version is utilities make a profit when they build infrastructure. So, and anytime there's something that reduces the need for infrastructure, it reduces their future earnings potential. So capital expenditures, that's how utilities make money. Let's go through a few states here. So in 2015, the New York Commission tried to look at how do we better compensate distributed energy resources. And they wanted to try to do it based on the time of generation and location of generation. So VDER is the value of distributed energy resources, and it was adopted in 2017 for larger commercial customers, industrial customers, and community solar. Notably, it was not adopted for residential customers because it was deemed too complicated. And residential customers were better off with a more simplistic compensation framework. I'll note that residential customers do pay a fee in New York now. And I'm happy to dive into that if you want. But the residential market is doing well in New York, and the other markets, the larger commercial customer markets, community solar, they're also doing very well in New York. If we look at Hawaii, in 2014, the commission in Hawaii started to look at net metering. And 1 year later, they moved to a post net metering framework. And there are three options. I'm not going to go into depth into the three options, but the end result is that the market shifted to serving commercial customers because commercial customers have a greater ability to install solar and not worry about any exports to the grid at all. Whereas the residential market really took a hit. The market contracted significantly in Hawaii. And there are still installations now, but most of those projects, the vast majority of those projects, are solar plus storage projects. I'll also note Hawaii by far has the highest installed rate per capita. California, you probably have heard about what's happened to California. California has gone through a few revisions in net metering. The most recent revision was last year, and there was a significant reduction in the export credit rate. And that has tanked the residential solar market in California. It has really, really hurt installers. We're seeing companies close. We're seeing solar layoffs. It has been quite catastrophic. I'll note that there are a lot of things going on in California in regard to electricity policy, but yeah, this net metering decision was quite catastrophic. So final thoughts here, a few things I want to try to leave with you. When we think about net metering, its greatest strength is also its greatest source of criticism, simplicity. It's easy for customers to understand net metering and really understand how they're going to make money or how they're going to be compensated. So it's very predictable. On the flip side of that, net metering is a bit of a blunt instrument. It doesn't compensate based on time or location. And that has been a very big source of criticism of net metering. I don't think that I could really do justice to net metering without talking a little bit about rate design. And that's because net metering really, it overlays the way in which people pay for electricity. So I will note that many of the criticisms that are laid on net metering, they're actually kind of criticisms of the underlying way people pay for electricity. And finally, the utility business model. Once again, don't have a lot of time to talk about this, but customer-owned solar does not make utilities money. It actually reduces future earnings potential of investor-owned utilities. And so we have a real confliction here. The interest of customers and the interest of utilities are really not necessarily aligned here. And I think that that gets to one of the major issues associated with talking about net metering. So thank you very much. And I will stop sharing so Angela can take it away.
While Angela's teeing up here, we've had this question just about California. I know, Angela, you're going to talk a little bit more about that, but I noticed this morning there was an article from Canary that talked about the solar installations are down like 85% or something like that since they passed those revisions to the net metering laws in California. But I'm sure we'll get into that a little bit more as we get into Angela's presentation.
Hi folks, I'm Angela Crowley Cook. I'm the Executive Director of OSEA, the Oregon Solar Plus Storage Industries Association. Thank you, Electrify Now, for having this really important talk webinar today. I apologize, I have a cold, so I'm doing my best. Okay. So OSEA is a trade association here in Oregon for solar companies, but we also have a lot of other solar stakeholders, nonprofits, educational organizations, public agencies. And I won't go too much over the slide. Thank you, Nathan, for really covering what net metering is. I'll just add in that net metering is really important right now as we're moving to electrify everything, because it doesn't require transmission, those big transmission lines that we need for larger scale renewable projects. Net metering is in your community. It relies on the distribution system. And so and it's closer to where folks are using electricity. So in order to get some of that clean energy on the grid now, net metering is really the way to go. So Nathan touched on this a little bit at the end of his talk. Why don't utilities want net metering? We've seen around the country how net metering has been rolled back. And it's true, it is a very simple answer. It is money, it is profit for their shareholders. In Oregon, especially, we aren't really seeing any impacts on rates from net metering because there just isn't that much of it. And so there aren't really impacts on the utility or on other customers. It's more that PGE is seeing what's happening in Idaho Power. They're kind of seeing what's happening around the country and really seizing that political moment and moving forward with a proposal of their own to roll back net metering. So we have two things happening here in Oregon. Idaho Power has a little slice of Oregon out on the eastern side near Ontario, and they've been working in Idaho for the last few years to roll back their net metering. And actually, they were successful in their Idaho territory of changing their net metering program. And you can see there that they slashed the export rate. And they made a new program that's really complicated and has peak seasons and off-peak seasons, peak times and off-peak times. Really hard to know as a solar customer when you are actually able to fully use your solar and even how to size your solar system, because they've moved to this net billing idea, which is, instead of having your credits for your net metered system kind of build up over the course of a month or over the course of a year, this real-time net billing is saying, if you're not using your solar at that particular moment, then it counts as an export. And you can imagine it's really challenging to use your solar every second of the day, exactly the amount of energy that it's producing. So it's really not fair to customers who have made this investment to have solar on their roof to provide energy to their grid and to their neighborhood, to be penalized in a way if you can't use your exact amount of solar in that moment. I really like to think of when we wake up in the morning and the sun is coming up, but we've already started using a bunch of energy. And then by the time we go to work, our solar is really kicking into high gear, but the energy consumption is less. So systems like this, where it's a real-time net billing, which unfortunately California also moved to, really does penalize the customer and is unfair. So in Idaho, excuse me, in Idaho, they did pass their changes to net metering, but the Oregon Public Utility Commission had some questions and asked Idaho Power to come back and try again this year. So we're waiting, could be any day now when Idaho Power comes back and tries to get their Oregon territory into this newer, weakened version of net metering. One interesting thing that Idaho Power is trying to do is to make these changes retroactive for some customers. So if you installed solar between 2020 and 2024, the changes now apply to you, which really isn't fair. The company says, well, they were notified that changes might happen, but of course they didn't know what the changes would be, and it really does feel like a breach of contract. So this is something we're on the lookout for in any proposed change to net metering, that it's really keeping those legacy customers whole and not going back on a promise that they made to that solar customer about rates. So now we have PGE, and for those of you not in Oregon, PGE is Portland General Electric, not to be confused with PG&E in California. PGE serves the Portland metro area in Oregon and also all the way down to our second largest city, Salem. And so they have taken a different sort of tactic, but unfortunately it's just as bad as a lot of the other proposals that we've seen. Instead of moving to a complicated system of peak times and peak seasons, they would restrict the current solar retail rates that Nathan talked about only for those who can afford to add battery storage to their solar system. And for those of you who have looked into battery storage, such a great idea. We all want to be able to have our power on when there's an outage. But it is pretty expensive still. Storage is still new, the prices are still coming down, and it's not affordable for everybody, especially for low and moderate income folks. And so if you can't afford to add that storage to your solar system, PGE's proposal would cut your export rates. They haven't named what that cut would be yet. Could be 20%, could be 70%, depending on what values they decide to use. But really that puts solar out of reach for a lot of folks who are just starting to get access to solar. The only exemption they've made, the only change they've made after listening to feedback from stakeholders, is to exempt those ratepayers on the income qualified bill discount program. So those are folks that are having trouble just paying their utility bills. So not a lot of those folks have solar or are good candidates to go solar. And we ran the numbers, and right now less than 1% of those ratepayers in that program have solar. So it's really not looking out for our low and moderate income customers who want to go solar. It's kind of lip service a little bit. So they have said, going back to that legacy customer issue, that current solar customers can keep their rates for 10 years before moving to the lower rate that they're proposing. Again, I'm not sure how PGE gets to decide what the rate of return is for these solar systems, it's different. Like Nathan said, the location matters of where your solar system is. And for those of you in Oregon, you know that on the west side of the mountains, it's pretty dang cloudy, and your rate of return might be longer than 10 years. So here's a slide that they put together to explain their program, and how they are wanting people to purchase batteries. The weird thing about their idea to purchase batteries, and of course, we would love to have also their customers have batteries and have that add that resiliency both to their own home and to the grid. But PGE says that they're going to control the batteries. They'll leave them full for you when there's a snowstorm or other emergency coming, but they want to control the batteries. I like to say that it's like if I bought a car, but then my landlord got to drive it whenever they wanted to, unless there was an emergency. So, a customer would be putting thousands of dollars into their solar and storage system. PGE so far is not offering any incentives for not only purchasing the battery system, but also to have them use the battery system. That's actually different from one of the pilot programs they have right now, where they use your battery when they need it, but then they compensate you for the use of that battery. So again, especially for low and moderate income customers and middle class customers who are able to purchase storage, what they're proposing is really not fair. If they did want to increase reliability on their grid, there's a lot of other ways to do that, like improving their own pilot program and spreading it more. So, like I've sort of hinted at, there's two main issues with this proposal. It really is inequitable. We are really just starting to have solar access be widespread between low and moderate income customers. Oregon, like many states, is getting federal money from the Solar for All grant to target solar adoption for low income ratepayers. And that goes for the next 5 years. So this is really not the time to be closing the door on solar for our low-income ratepayers. We should be doing more to help them go solar and reduce their bills at a time when we're seeing utility rates increase by double digits. In terms of climate, Oregon has a 100% clean electricity standard that utilities need to reach that by 2040. And PGE itself said that they need more rooftop solar in order to reach those goals. Again, because rooftop solar doesn't require those big, expensive, long permitting time transmission lines, rooftop solar is really important for utilities to be able to meet their goals. And so we need folks to be active on this. We need your help. The Oregon Public Utility Commission heard the Idaho Power proposal once. They're going to hear it again in a few months. If you are an Idaho Power customer that lives in Oregon, we really need your help. So please do reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat. And then the PGE hasn't actually filed their proposal at the Public Utility Commission yet. We do have a petition that you can see down there at the bottom, where you can sign on to send PGE a message that they should not be making these changes right now. And we'll really need everyone to get involved to make sure that we're retaining the fairness in our net metering. And I also want to put in a plug for SUN that was mentioned earlier, Solar United Neighbors. Please sign up on their list to get active. If you care about rooftop solar and you want it to be a part of the clean energy transition, SUN is who you need to get involved with. They are mobilizing solar customers all across the country to make sure that we're protecting customers and we're increasing access to solar and not restricting it. I think I'll stop there and happy to answer any questions.
Thanks so much, Angela. Just a quick note on this slide. We'll want to get folks, if we can get a link to that petition to put in the chat right now, that would probably be easiest. And then we'll also send that out with our slides and recording afterwards. Just so.
Oh, and I forgot to mention, Brian, too, that if you represent an organization There's different actions that we're asking organizations to take. So please also email me. I just put, oops, I just realized I did not send my email to everybody. So let me do that again. To everybody, send my email. So please get in touch with me if you are at an organization who might want to get involved.
Great, thank you. Thank you, both of you, those really good presentations. I want to start maybe diving this a little bit in a kind of really high level. So obviously, anybody who's sort of following the renewable energy transition, people are very aware of this issue that is just a part of the renewables conversation, where intermittency it's called, or whatever, where the time that we're absorbing energy from the sun or from the wind isn't always necessarily the same time that we're needing to use the energy. So there is inherent in this switch to renewable energy a storage conversation that has to happen. And when you look at states like Oregon that have laws mandating that we get to 100% renewable energy, and of course we're blessed with a lot of hydro, but that still means a lot of wind and solar that needs to be added to our grid, then the concept of having storage to smooth out the differences between when we get energy and when we use it is critical. So I get that, and but I think what's to me is, and obviously rooftop solar has those issues just like utility scale solar would. But the thing that I don't quite understand is there's all this focus on rooftop solar and storage when it's a relatively small part of this giant storage problem that the utilities have looming. When you think of all the wind and solar that Oregon needs to add to our grid here in order to achieve this 100% clean energy, it's like roughly 100 times what the storage and capacity will be from rooftop solar from residential customers. So it just feels to me like the storage for rooftop solar owners is like a rounding error in the storage conversation that these utilities need to be having about how they're going to deal with this basic transition. And I don't understand why they would incur all this like public bad will for something that's just like a tiny fraction, it seems to me, of their overall operating, kind of needs. I don't know. Am I missing something there, or what do you guys think about that?
Well, first disclosure, I'm not sure what PGE's motivations are, to be clear. So I'm not speaking about why PGE is going down this road. From my perspective, though, I think this gets to a larger issue. Storage is going to be essential as we transition over to renewables. That's just a fact. But we actually need to change the way we think about customers and how we use electricity too. Historically, customers were a load that needed to be served. And then utilities just went forth and figured out, how do we build enough generation and transmission and distribution in order to serve customers? That's ancient thinking nowadays. Customers are dynamic. Customers can shape load. Customers can react to price signals. So we need to think of customers, and this gets to storage located at people's homes and businesses. But we need to think of customers as a resource, so part of the solution. And this gets to the idea of virtual power plants as an example, which we don't have a lot of time to go into, but that idea really is fundamental to customers as a resource.
Angela, any thoughts on that as well?
I think Nathan put it really well. I think it's a little disingenuous for utilities to be talking about how green they are and they have all these climate goals and green energy aspirations, but then they turn around and make changes that would cut their rooftop solar and their net metering programs.
Thanks. So we got to this a little bit in your slides, Nathan, and then someone was asking a question. Is there a net metering tipping point where the penetration of solar is so high that net metering becomes too costly? And what would that be? We maybe saw that in Hawaii. Did that get to that in California? Any thoughts on on penetration numbers to get to that tipping point?
It's a good question. I don't have an answer for you. I think that Hawaii probably did reach a point. They had reached, when they decided to make a change, they were, if I recall correctly, in the 35 to 40% penetration rate for solar on residential customers' homes. And so by that point in time, the grid was changing altogether. So the historical structure of net metering may not have made sense anymore in Hawaii. Most states are not close to that, including California, by the way. Most states are not even remotely close to where Hawaii was. So I don't think that most states, it makes sense to transition away from net metering. There may be some situations where it makes sense to transition away certain sectors. So in New York, as an example, they transitioned community solar off of net metering. They transitioned large commercial and industrial customers off of net metering. One of the big things about that, though, is those entities are sophisticated. They oftentimes have people dedicated just to energy. So it's easy to transition them over to something that's much more complicated, like real-time pricing type of thing.
Angela, on that front, are these proposed changes from PGE, would they apply to commercial customers as well as residential customers, or is this just a residential?
They would apply to commercial customers, and that's especially worrying when we think about multifamily housing. It's very hard to put solar on affordable housing. It is complicated federal regulations, state, local utility regulations. And part of that Solar for All money I mentioned in Oregon is going to really work to reduce some of those problems and increase solar and multifamily housing. And so this change couldn't come at a worse time for both residential and commercial projects.
Nathan, I think I asked you this earlier, but I think it was a good conversation we were having about, put you on the spot a little bit. I mean, is there a state you think is like really nailed it in terms of figuring out this sort of post net metering future, and that could be used as a blueprint for other states, or is it just a mess?
Well, I don't think it's binary. I don't think there's a perfect, and I don't think it's a mess. I don't think that there's a state that has figured it out, to be clear. I think that there are states that have done some good things. So I like that New York really looked at different sectors of the economy as far as how to move forward. I don't like everything New York did, though. I don't think that there's a state that is the example. I think there are good things we can pull from some different states.
Thanks, Nathan. Your slide showing the cost, the causes of increased utility costs was really fascinating. That capital expenditures are, the biggest, according to that 2015 study, the biggest driver of costs. And yet capital expenditures are the way that utilities make money. Is there a way out of this conundrum so they're not blaming solar and trying to get rid of residential solar? Someone was asking, are public utility districts, PUDs, the way to do it? What are your thoughts on how to get out of this?
Oh, that we don't have enough time to get into all of this, but a few different things. First, I think a way to do it is to change the way that utilities make money, first and foremost. So capital expenditures as a rationale for how the utilities make money, that's very, very antiquated nowadays. That idea goes back 150 years at this point in time. So we need to change the way the utilities make money. Here's a novel idea. How about we compensate utilities on how well they perform? And that's really at the heart of performance-based regulation. So changing the way that utilities make money, that can better align the interest of the investor-owned utilities and the interest of customers. Now, should we switch from, say, investor-owned utilities to publicly owned utilities, whether that is, state-owned or municipally owned? That is certainly a path. It has been extremely difficult to do to date. There are very few examples of that actually working out. Maine, for instance, had a ballot measure recently, and that failed. So the ballot measure was to essentially have the state take over all of the investor-owned utilities. There's a lot of fear of change, and that goes for a lot of things in life, but one of the fears of switching away from an investor-owned utility to a publicly owned utility is just, what does that mean? So it can be a really good idea and it can be a path forward, but it is not a silver bullet, so to speak.
Great, thanks for that. Brian, do you have another question?
Yeah, so Angela, I got a question for you, just back to the Oregon situation. I seem to remember that PGE has one of their justifications for this switch was a concern they have about peak loads at a very specific time of year, and how, you know, solar right now is not helping them, rooftop solar is not helping them with that, but that I think their argument goes that if they had solar associated with it, could be helping that. Could you just explain that a little bit more for people, so people understand what PG's talking about in that case?
Sure. So in Oregon, one of our impacts of climate change has been that our summers are getting hotter and hotter. We're a place that didn't used to have air conditioners at all 20 years ago. And now we need them because it's very hot in the summer. And so in late August, it's getting to be very hot, but the sun is already starting to go down during peak hours. And that's where PGE is worried about having a shortage of capacity. And so it's true. If we had more batteries on the system, yes, that would absolutely help with their reliability problem. But solar is not the cause of their reliability problems. So why would they penalize solar because they have a reliability problem? It doesn't really add up. Solar and storage can definitely help, but you can't get around this issue that, you know, most solar customers are middle income customers, middle and moderate income customers. Battery storage is out of reach for most of those folks. And including a penalty doesn't make storage more affordable. If you really want customers to buy more storage, you have to incentivize it and you have to provide compensation when the utility uses their battery storage.
That's basically the virtual power plant idea. Is that you were mentioning earlier? Is that right, Nathan? That you have this distributed kind of generation and storage, and then you have a way of compensating people when the grid taps into that resource. Is that a good description?
Correct. That's the basic idea of it. And virtual power plants, they can be a platform of different types of resources too. So it can be energy storage, it can be demand response, it can be, you know, any type of way of customers being able to put more electricity onto the grid or use less electricity.
That's the other thing that strikes me about this conversation we're having right now, just being so like premature. It's because it feels like we're on the cusp of some really big changes to the way our energy systems are going to work. You know, we've had amongst this group some conversation about EVs and, you know, the massive storage potential of that. And I understand that that's not like ready for prime time at the moment, but there's very fast changes happening in that sector where there's now standards for a vehicle to grid that have been adopted by SAE and could be adopted in the next wave of EVs. And EVs or manufacturers are talking about that. So, you know, that becomes a like several orders of magnitude greater potential storage capacity than home batteries probably ever would be. That's not here yet, but it's on the horizon. And it's part of this conversation about VPPs and distributed systems that just feel inevitably to be the future. So it just kind of feels to me like we should be putting pause on this net metering conversation until we get further down the road on these other complications that, you know, might make this conversation moot, given all these other things that are happening. I don't know. What do you both think about that?
I'm going to get a little theoretical with this.
Okay.
when we think about what seems so obvious about how changes are going to happen and how quickly they can happen, that's not exactly how it will manifest in the regulatory environment. Specifically, what I mean by that is utility regulation is not exactly known for innovation. It is not exactly known for moving very quickly on changing ideas or approaches or anything like that. So what may seem obvious to you, Brian, and to me too, to be fair, I'm skeptical it's going to happen quickly due to the regulatory environment that we live in.
You know,
there's a question that keeps getting asked in the chat about the impact of net metering on low and moderate income customers that don't have solar. So I want to take a moment to address that. This is something that Nathan addressed early when he was talking about this idea that solar can actually cost customers who don't have it and cost the system. That, first of all, that's never been proven to be true. Utilities love to talk about it, but they haven't actually ever proven that. In Oregon, specifically, we have the Citizens Utility Board, who is a nonprofit that is the ratepayer advocate. And they've said in the Portland Business Journal article that there really has been a negligible impact, and that's not a concern right now. I think we can see, for me, I think everyone deserves to have the choice to produce their own clean energy. It shouldn't matter how much income you have. And so in Oregon, we're really ramping up programs that provide bigger incentives to low and moderate income ratepayers to go solar. We also have a community solar program, which helps renters be able to go solar. And then now we have finally this 5-year Solar for All federal grant money that I mentioned, specifically targeted at low-income customers. And so it feels like, and I'm borrowing this analogy from a low-income advocate that I work with here in Oregon, we're finally opening the door to solar for low and moderate income customers. It's not the time to shut it. We need to work harder to expand access. And if there are some cost impacts, that's way in the future. It's not at a 5% penetration rate like we have in Oregon.
Yeah, I love to jump on that and pile on that and agree with you, Angela. And I think one of the things that's always, again, this comes back to the cost benefit balance that Nathan was talking about. And it's so easy to quantify costs, and it's harder to quantify benefits. But if you think about this, the advantage that rooftop solar has to low and moderate income households, where their energy costs are potentially a huge portion of their overall operating expenses, and for well-to-do customers, their energy bills are not something they sweat about, and saving a few percentage on their energy bills isn't going to make a difference between them being able to feed their family or not. Whereas in lower income situations, that switch from having to pay a lot of money from energy to paying much less for energy is a way more meaningful thing. And so it feels like, I wish we had some way of quantifying that benefit, to society that comes from, making these people less energy burdened, more able to, provide for their families and for all the other things that are just as important as energy. So I do feel like there should be a way that we accentuate that kind of equity argument here in relation to solar.
I totally agree. And I did want to bring up a point on on California that came up a lot in questions. I mean, we're seeing that as like a prime example of how to destroy the solar industry with the 85% that Brian managed, or 85% reduction in solar installations that Brian referenced earlier. Some folks were asking, are there efforts afoot to reverse the decision from last year? And did another person asked if they made any difference for equity-focused customers if they still get a higher solar rate? So 2 questions there. Maybe Nathan, if you wanted to start on that.
Sure. Notably on trying to reverse what the California Public Utility Commission did, there's some legislation that has been proposed in order to reverse the net metering NEM 3 decision. I don't know if that's going to go forward or not. It's too early to really know on that. So we'll have to wait and see. In regard to options for low income or vulnerable, low wealth, vulnerable customers, there are some provisions in NEM3 in order to help those customers. In my opinion, it's not enough. And unfortunately, in some of the other avenues in regard to, say, community solar in California, unfortunately, in my opinion, California has failed again in trying to actually help the most vulnerable customers. So it gets back to what Angela was just saying, you know, at a time where we actually are seeing costs decrease to the point where people of all income brackets, the most vulnerable populations, can benefit from solar, we're now closing the door on them.
Thanks for that. A quick question for you. Someone was asking, how do I find the status of net metering in my state? We've been talking about a couple of the key states now. Is there a good way to check on a person's local state?
Sure. There's the Desire website, which is the database of state. I'm going to screw up the acronym here, but it's DSIRE. That's a good database. And unfortunately, this type of stuff is changing very quickly. So just a word of caution, if you do go to, say, the Desire database, that it is maybe not up to date. So you just have to be a little cautious.
I had one more question. I know we're getting close to time here, but Angela or Nathan, either of you jump in on this. The question of cost and benefit, I want to come back to that because, and I know, Angela, you mentioned, you know, things like rooftop solar avoids new transmission lines and permitting issues and all sort of. So has there been an attempt, let's start with Oregon. In Oregon, did anybody or in this conversation around potential changes to net metering rules try to quantify those benefits? Or are we just doing what Nathan talked about before, being really good about qualifying costs and sort of ignoring trying to quantify the benefits?
I'll say a little bit first, but Nathan can probably answer this better than me. We, in Oregon in particular, we tried to quantify the value of solar, and it all comes down to how you the parameters you put on the methodology of what's included as an environmental benefit. I saw someone in the Q&A say that in Idaho Power, no environmental benefits were included in the value of solar. And so in Oregon, unfortunately, environmental benefits were not included in the value of solar. And so that's one of those fights that you want to be careful what you ask for when you pick that fight, because utilities and their lawyers have a lot of resources to really minimize all the benefits of solar and instead really focus on those costs.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to what Angela just said there is anytime there's some uncertainty, there's uncertainty in everything, but anytime there's some uncertainty about what the benefit would be, that's an opportunity for opponents of net metering to justify, oh, we should really reduce that. And sometimes the argument is we should really reduce that to 0, even though we know it's never actually 0. So it is a very difficult argument, oftentimes highly contentious.
Thanks so much, all. I know we're running up on time. Huge thanks to Nathan and Angela for this great webinar. We will send out the recording and the slides afterwards, and we'll send out some of these petitions and other resources for you to sign. Brian, anything else to say to our audience?
Well, first of all, I thank you all for tuning in today. And like Angela said, if there's something you're passionate about, please use these links to help get involved and make your voice heard in this important conversation. And thank you again to Nathan and Angela for showing up today and helping us unpack this really complicated topic. I can't think of two better people to have had here for this conversation. And I'd also just say, as we always say, all of you who are out there thinking about electrification in your homes, good luck with your projects. And if you have questions or anything we can help you with, please reach out to Joe or I. We'll try to connect you to resources to help you solve your situation for you personally. And thanks for tuning in.
Thanks, all.